How could a civilization built over 600 years collapse so rapidly in just 2 years? How could a city of 200,000 people larger than London or Paris at the time undergo such a drastic transformation at the hands of a 500-strong army that arrived by sea and had never seen the place before? How did an empire that controlled millions of people, built pyramids without metal tools, and managed one of the most advanced agricultural systems in the ancient world come to an end, not through a long struggle, but through a transformation so rapid that those living through it could barely comprehend what was happening? And why, when Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in 1519, did the Aztec Emperor not immediately send an army to stop him? This video will answer these questions. But before we delve into the transformation, we need to understand what was lost. Tenochtitlan was not just a city. It was one of the greatest achievements in human civilization. Yet almost no one knows its name. Even today, very few people know it. Let's start the video by discussing this topic in part 1. Here we go. Before we discuss transformation, we need to talk about water. Tenochtitlan wasn't built on land, after all. It was built on Lake Texcoco. Lake Texcoco, to be precise, central Mexico. It was 2,200 meters above sea level. This vast, shallow body of water was chosen by the Mexica people as the site of their capital city. Not because it was easy, but because it was defensible, but because it could be defended. It was far ahead of its time. Connected to the mainland by only 3 crossings, each of which could be controlled or removed, the city could not be approached without permission. Access was granted only on the defenders' terms. The Mexica understood something that few other civilizations grasped at their founding. Geography is not a constraint. It is a strategic advantage. It must be used effectively. So who were the Mexica? By A.D. 1300, they were a newly emerging group. They migrated south into the Valley of Mexico from the north. They had no settled land. They had no allies. They had no reputation. Every city-state in the region merely viewed them as a useful labor force. Nothing more. They were shuttled from place to place. Eventually, they settled on the swampy edges of Lake Texcoco land that no one else wanted. Then, according to their traditions, they saw a sign. An eagle. It was perched on a cactus. It was holding a snake. On a small island in the lake, according to the sign, this was the right place. They stopped. And they built. What they built in less than 200 years was extraordinary. It was far ahead of its time. Chinampas. These were floating gardens built from layers of aquatic plants, mud, and soil, and anchored to the lakebed by their roots. These artificial islands were capable of growing corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers. This farming system was productive enough to feed a city of 200,000 people in the middle of the lake. Aqueducts. 2 stone aqueducts carried fresh water from sources on the mainland because the lake water was salty and undrinkable. This was an engineering feat on a scale that would have impressed any civilization of the time. Passages. 3 large raised roads connected the island to the mainland, each one wide enough for 8 people to walk side by side. They had removable sections that could be adjusted to control access. At the center of it all was the Templo Mayor. This twin pyramid rises 60 meters above the city. It was dedicated to 2 gods, Huitzilopochtli, who was associated with the sun, and Tlaloc, who was associated with rain. It was the symbolic center of the Aztec universe. Everything radiated from this point. By 1519, the Aztec Triple Alliance governed a region stretching from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Resources flowed in from 38 provinces. Millions of people were integrated into the empire's economic and political structures. Tenochtitlan had a functioning legal system. It was one of the first ancient societies to have an official educational structure where both boys and girls were required to attend school. It also had an advanced calendar. It also had a complex philosophical tradition that scholars are still striving to fully understand. This was not a simple civilization facing a more advanced one. It was one of the most advanced urban civilizations on Earth, facing a power it had never imagined and lacked any framework to comprehend. Far beyond Europe, this gap in understanding on both sides is where the story of transformation truly begins. If this story is changing your perspective on history, subscribe, leave a comment. What do you think the Aztec Emperor was thinking when he first heard of Cortés? Was Hernán Cortés just a soldier? What impact would he have from this point onward? Now, let's move on to part 2 and discuss these topics. Hernán Cortés was there without authorization. The expedition he organized to Mexico in 1519 lacked official approval. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had authorized an exploratory mission, not a conquest, not a settlement, an exploration. When Velázquez changed his mind and tried to cancel the expedition, Cortés set out anyway. To ensure that his men would not be able to return, he deliberately ran most of his fleet aground on the Mexican coast, rendering the ships unusable. This demonstrates Cortés' character and strategic mindset. First, let's talk about who Cortés was. He was born in 1,485 inches, the Extremadura region of Spain. He was a minor nobleman. Although he received a legal education, he never practiced law. He arrived in the Caribbean at the age of 19. He spent the next 15 years in Cuba, observing how the colonial administration, including resource extraction, interacted with indigenous communities. He wasn't a great military commander in the traditional sense. He had no experience of leading large armies. He had no formal military training. What he possessed was something rarer. He had the ability to read people, much like the successful CEOs of the modern world. He understood what motivated them. He could find a foothold in any situation and apply exactly the right pressure at exactly the right moment. Above all, he was a strategist. The strategic situation he faced in Mexico in 1519 was more complex than anything he could have planned, and it offered even greater opportunities. This was because the Aztec Empire was not universally accepted by all those it ruled over. In fact, one could say that there was no clear unity among them. Over the course of a century, the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, had incorporated neighboring peoples into its administrative and tribute system. Some had joined willingly. Many had not. The Tlaxcalans, for example, the Totonacs, dozens of other groups were forced into a system they had no choice but to accept. Cortés understood this immediately. He did not arrive as an external force against a united empire. Rather, he arrived as a potential ally for all those who were angry with the Aztecs. His first major move was not military, it was diplomatic. He established relationships with coastal groups. He listened. He gathered intelligence. Through his interpreter, Malinche, a multilingual indigenous woman who played a central role in these events, he identified groups dissatisfied with the Aztecs, ascertained where they might support an alternative, and pinpointed key pressure points. When Cortés began his march towards Tenochtitlan, he did not have 500 men at his disposal. He had 500 Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies who saw his arrival as a potential liberation from Aztec authority. And Moctezuma II was watching all of this. He was receiving reports. He was sending envoys. He sent extraordinary gifts of gold, featherwork, and precious stones, perhaps hoping the foreigners would be satisfied and leave. However, their expectations were not merely to find gold and valuable goods, and they did not leave. What do you think Moctezuma might have felt when he realized that the gifts were not enough? This brings us to the topic we'll cover in Chapter 3, because when Cortés finally reached the pass leading to Tenochtitlan, one of the most extraordinary moments in human history followed, and no one fought. Why didn't they fight? Let's discuss that in Chapter 3. 8 November 1519, Cortés and his formidable force of Spanish soldiers, bolstered by thousands of indigenous allies, arrive at the entrance to the southern causeway leading into Tenochtitlan. Before them lay a city unlike anything any European had ever seen. A city on a lake. Pyramids rose above the waterline. Causeways stretched across the water in 3 directions. Canoes moved between the buildings. Markets were visible from a distance. The population dwarfed any city in Spain. Decades later, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who was there, wrote that they stood and looked and could not find words. Some of them even asked whether they were dreaming. They were not dreaming. Moctezuma II advanced to meet them, not with an army or a defensive formation, but in a ceremonial procession. He was carried on a litter, accompanied by nobles. Attendants swept the ground before his feet so that nothing unclean would touch them. The 2 men met in the middle of the causeway. They greeted each other. But why? This is the question that has occupied historians for 5 centuries. The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Our understanding is inherently shaped by the sources, which were predominantly written by the victors, by Spanish chroniclers, by indigenous accounts recorded after the event and influenced by what happened subsequently. However, several things seem clear. Moctezuma was not naive. He was not simply unaware of the situation. He had been receiving reports for months. He knew that the Spanish had formed alliances with groups who resented Aztec authority. He knew they had demonstrated significant military capability, and yet he chose to receive them rather than resist. Why? There were several reasons, and they mattered. First, the political calculation. Tenochtitlan's power rested not only on its military strength, but also on the perception of its invincibility. Direct confrontation on the causeway, even successful confrontation, risked casualties, disruption, and the perception of vulnerability. Allowing the strangers into the city, where the Aztecs could control every variable, may have seemed the more strategically sound approach. Secondly, there was the intelligence gap. The Aztecs had no framework for understanding what the Spanish represented. They did not just represent a military force, but also the advance of a civilization with entirely different technologies, diseases, and goals. The full implications of what was standing on that causeway could not have been apparent to anyone present. Our understanding is inherently shaped by knowing what came after. They did not have that knowledge. Third, and this is the most human reason of all, Moctezuma may simply have been buying time. He was trying to understand what he was dealing with before committing to a course of action that could not be undone. Cortés and his troops were accommodated in a palace in Tenochtitlan. They were guests. For several weeks, 2 civilizations that had never known of each other's existence shared the same city. Spanish soldiers walked through the markets of Tlatelolco, unable to believe what they saw. Aztec nobles observed the Spanish, trying to make sense of them. This encounter is arguably the most extraordinary in human history, and it lasted in this fragile, suspended form for about 2 months. Then Cortés made a decision that changed everything. This brings us to the subject of Part 4, because what Cortés did next was not a military operation. It was political. It came from inside the palace. That's what we're covering in Part 4.
We cannot trust the strangers. They must leave.
November 1519. Within the palace walls, accompanied by a small group of armed guards, Cortés quietly informed Moctezuma II that ostensibly for his own safety, he was now the Spaniards' guest. Moctezuma, besieged in his palace by the full might of Tenochtitlan, theoretically under his command, yielded to this demand. This single act revealed far more about the situation than any military clash could have done. Why did it work? Because Cortés had grasped something about the Aztec political system that took historians centuries to fully comprehend. Unlike the absolute power of European monarchs, the Aztec emperor's authority was relational and performative. Power had to be constantly demonstrated through divine grace and invincibility. An emperor who appeared to be under the influence of external powers, whether voluntarily or for diplomatic reasons, was an emperor whose authority had already begun to erode. Cortés did not need to defeat the Aztec army. He needed to undermine the emperor's legitimacy, and he had succeeded. Moctezuma remained at the Spanish headquarters for several months. He continued to conduct state affairs. He issued orders. He received visitors. From the outside, the empire appeared to be functioning as usual. Yet the foundations had been shaken. The people of Tenochtitlan knew this. Then, in the spring of 1520, Cortés was forced to temporarily leave Tenochtitlan. A Spanish force had arrived from Cuba, sent by Governor Velázquez to bring Cortés back and make him face the consequences of his unauthorized expedition. Cortés left a garrison in Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado. However, Alvarado made a decision that undid everything Cortés had so carefully built. During the Aztecs' important Tenochtitlan festival, Alvarado ordered his troops to attack the gathered Aztec nobles and participants. The reason behind Alvarado's harsh order remains a matter of debate. Was it fear of an uprising, a preemptive strike, or a critical misjudgment? Whatever the cause, the result was an irreparable rupture. Tenochtitlan rose up. When Cortés returned, he faced open resistance in the city. He had lost the position he had so carefully maintained as a guest, diplomat, and foreign power operating within the political system. Moctezuma, brought out from behind the palace walls to address the crowd, was met not with respect, but with the people's profound rejection. He died shortly afterwards, and the details and causes of his death remain disputed in historical records. With Moctezuma's death, the final link between the Spanish presence and Aztec legitimacy had been severed. On the night of 30 June, 1520, known in Spanish sources as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night, Cortés attempted to lead his forces out of Tenochtitlan via a passageway. The Aztecs were waiting. The Spaniards and their allies suffered heavy losses. It is said that Cortés wept at the sight of the casualties. However, he did not abandon Mexico. He regrouped. He rebuilt his alliances. He gathered more indigenous supporters, people who had their own reasons for wanting to see a change in Aztec authority over their lives. Then he began to plan his final move. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Cortés' plan would have worked if it weren't for Alvarado's mistake? Let's move straight on to Chapter 5. Here we'll examine the final chapter of Tenochtitlan and the profound impact of its transformation.
We will return to take that city. España expects victory.
13 August, 1521. Tenochtitlan falls. Not in one dramatic moment, nor with a single decisive engagement. Rather, it was the result of a 75-day siege, during which the city's water supply was cut off. Its causeways were controlled, and its population was forced to endure conditions that reduced one of history's greatest urban centers to a shadow of its former self. The last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured while attempting to escape across Lake Texcoco by canoe. When brought before Cortés, he reportedly said, "I have done everything in my power to defend my city. Do with me as you will." What was lost? The chinampas, the floating gardens that had sustained 200,000 people, were abandoned. The aqueducts were damaged. The Templo Mayor was dismantled. A cathedral was built on its foundations, using its stones. The manuscripts, the codices, centuries of accumulated knowledge were largely lost, permanently and irretrievably lost. The Nahuatl language survived, however. It is still spoken today by over 1 million people in Mexico, at least that endured. But the extraordinary, impossible, magnificent city on the lake is gone. It lies beneath the streets of modern Mexico City, beneath the cathedral, beneath the Zócalo, the central square, where millions of people walk every day without knowing what lies beneath their feet. Tenochtitlan is still there, just buried. It took 600 years to build this civilization. It created floating gardens, stone aqueducts, formal education, and a calendar of extraordinary precision. It was transformed not only by outside force, but also by political manipulation and epidemic diseases to which the Aztecs had no immunity, as well as by the strategic brilliance of a man who understood that the most powerful instrument is not the sword, but the story people tell about it. It was also transformed by the decisions, some brilliant, some catastrophic, of people on both sides who were trying to understand something they had never encountered before. The story of Tenochtitlan is not just the story of a lost city. It is the story of what happens when two sophisticated, complete worlds, each certain of its own reality, meet without warning. Neither side is ever the same again. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. Share it with someone who thinks history is just dates and names. Tell us in the comments what you think would have happened if the first meeting on the causeway had gone differently. We'll see you in the next one.